Hey everybody, it's Adam from Rescue Michigan, and this is an impromptu live stream. It's not our normal time at all. It's the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, but I wanted to talk about something that is kind of a big topic, might take some time to go through. Figured might as well do this now instead of waiting for our regular Sunday stream, when I'm sure we'll have plenty more to talk about with all the crazy stuff going on in Lansing. But I did want to cover this because Tucker Carlson recently sent a survey to all of the Republican candidates and rumored candidates for president, and got answers from quite a few of them. And he read parts of their answers on his show. And we wanted to go through the whole thing, read all of their answers, talk about what they said, what this suggests about, number one, what their policies might actually be, and number two, what this suggests about how the presidential race might be shaping up on the Republican side. So let's get right to it, shall we? We're gonna read through each of these, and I'll probably stop at points and just talk about what the candidates are saying about one thing or the next. So the first response is from former President Donald Trump, and here's what his response is. Tucker has some questions, and I think he's just starting off with a statement in the beginning. So he says, like inflation and numerous other self-inflicted wounds and mistakes made over the past 2 years, Russia would definitely not have raided and attacked Ukraine if I was your president. In fact, for 4 years, as they didn't attack, nor did they have any intention of doing so as long as I was in charge. Well, maybe. Questionable. Yeah, Patty says Trump's response was all about himself. Yeah, that's the way they do it. That's Trump's style. And I don't necessarily hold it against Trump for his style. Although it should be pointed out, Russia's decision to invade Ukraine had little, I think, less to do with who was the president of the United States than the fact that NATO was arming Ukraine, and Trump's policy was not to put a stop to that. In fact, he told Europe to spend more money in NATO. So the question of timing is an open one, but again, a lot of it's just campaign rhetoric from Trump. But he goes on, he says, but the sad fact is, due to a lack of respect for the U.S., caused at least partially by our incompetently handled pullout from Afghanistan, true, and a very poor choice of words by Biden explaining the U.S. requests and intentions, Biden's first statement was that Russia could have some of Ukraine, no problem. I don't remember ever hearing Biden say that, but okay. The bloody and expensive assault began and continues to this day. That is all history, but how does it end? And it must end now. Start by telling Europe that they must pay at least equal what the U.S. is paying to help Ukraine. Yeah, that'll work. Sure. Well, of course, the U.S. has been pressuring Europe to pay more for Ukraine. They've been doing that intensively. The only powers that really wanted to be involved in Ukraine were the U.S. and Britain, and a couple others, maybe Norway, but not Germany. We destroyed their pipeline to prevent them from having any peace with Russia. But he goes on. They must also pay us retroactively the difference. And again, we've been calling upon Europe to pay more for the war constantly. At a staggering $125 billion, we are paying 4 to 5 times more, and this fight is far more important for Europe than it is for the U.S. Again, not true. This was a fight that was provoked by the U.S., that was part of our policy to damage Russia, a policy that just completely, utterly backfired. But this was our war, not Europe's war, other than, again, Britain was a major instigator with the sabotaging of the peace talks last April, with Boris Johnson in particular. But this is not a war that Europe wanted to get into. This is a war that the United States and Britain wanted to get into. So he goes on. Next, tell Ukraine that there will be a little more money coming from us. Little more money, not no more money. Unless Russia continues to prosecute the war. So if Russia continues the war, then we will continue to fund Ukraine, is what Donald Trump is saying. Now, again, if Trump wins the White House in 2025, the war will be over by then. So that's not going to be an issue. The war is going to be over before the end of this year. But even in hypothetical, he's just saying right here, yeah, I will give Ukraine more money if the war goes on. That's what he's saying. Unless Russia continues to prosecute the war, we're going to continue to fund you, which they will. I mean, Russia has said we are going to demilitarize Ukraine and ensure that they cannot threaten Russia. Trump goes on. The president must work with each side, then both sides together to quickly work out a deal. This can be easily done if conducted by the right president. Both sides are weary and ready to make a deal. Again, dubious at best. And Russia said, yeah, we'll make a deal if it's on our terms, and our terms are demilitarizing Ukraine. And Ukraine's not ready to make that deal, so that's not going to happen. And Russia does not seem to be all that weary either. The meetings must start immediately, and there's no time to spare. The death and destruction must end now. Properly executed, this terrible and tragic war, a war that never should have started in the first place, will come to a speedy end. God bless America. So that's Trump's, introductory answer. And now Tucker asked some questions. Is opposing Russia and Ukraine a vital American strategic national interest? No, but it is for Europe, but not for the United States. That is why Europe should be paying far more than we are, or equal. Well, he says it's not for the United States. That's a good thing. Is it for Europe? No, not really. Ruth says Trump has confidence, and that's why some say he's boastful. He has bragging rights on many issues. He has flaws too. I feel his confidence and strength outweigh his flaws. Yeah, that's a fair point. Trump is a mixed bag and on balance better than most presidents have been, including most Republican presidents. And some of what he's saying here is clearly campaign rhetoric. I mean, this is stuff that Trump is clearly saying that he believes his base wants to hear, and that might be true. But I'm going to just say objectively what I think is the right answer. And the war in Ukraine is not of strategic interest to Europe. It's a harm to Europe. It's benefiting Russia. It's benefiting China. It's benefiting Iran. It's benefiting really everybody except the West. It's been a huge disaster for us. And again, the U.S. and Britain dragged Europe into the war. What specifically is our objective in Ukraine, and how will we know when we've achieved it? Our objective in Ukraine is to help secure Europe, but Europe isn't helping itself. They are relying on the United States to do it largely for them. That's very unfair to us, especially since Europe takes advantage of us on trade and other things. Again, completely, totally untrue, total gibberish. The bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline was a huge advantage to the U.S. at the expense of Europe. We forced Europe to buy American gas at huge premiums. They're now importing Russian oil and gas through middlemen at huge premiums. So this has been of a strategic value to the U.S., not to Europe. We've taken advantage of Europe terribly. What is the limit of funding and materiel you'd be willing to send to the government of Ukraine? That would strongly depend on my meeting with President Putin in Russia. Russia would never have attacked Ukraine if I were president, not even a small chance. Would have never happened if I were president, but it has. I would have to see the direction in which Russia has headed. I would want them to stop, and they will, depending on the one that delivers the message. But with everything said, Europe must pay. The United States has spent much more on Europe, and that is not fair, just, or equitable. If I were president, that horrible war would end in 24 hours or less. It can be done, and it must be done now. Again, a lot of campaign bluster. And we can't know what might have been if Trump had been president. And maybe Putin would have been direct and said, you need to stop arming Ukraine, and we won't invade. And maybe Trump would have, but who knows? Should the United States support regime change in Russia? No, we should support regime change in the United States. That's far more important. The Biden administration are the ones who got us into this mess. Perfect answer. Can't get any better. Great job, President Trump. Given that Russia's economy and currency are stronger than before the war, do you believe that sanctions have been effective? No, they have not been effective. Just the opposite. They drove Russia, China, and Iran into an unthinkable situation. Also 100% correct. Good job, Trump. Do you believe the United States faces the risk of nuclear war with Russia? It depends on who the president of the United States is. At the moment, with Biden as president, absolutely yes. He says and does all the wrong things at the wrong time. Again, spot on. So on balance, very good answers. Again, I think some of the things he's saying aren't true, but I think that, it's campaign rhetoric. It's not the end of the world. So I'll give Trump a solid, probably a B+ on those answers. So there you go. That's President Trump. Now let's see what Ron DeSantis has to say. And again, it appears that I don't see the answers to the questions here, or the questions being rephrased. So maybe he's just going through it. But let's just read what he says. While the U.S. has many vital national interests, including securing our borders, addressing the crisis of readiness within our military, achieving energy security and independence, and checking the economic, cultural, and military power of the Chinese Communist Party, Becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them. The Biden administration's virtual blank check funding of this conflict for as long as it takes, without any defined objectives or accountability, distracts from our country's most pressing challenges. Every single thing he says there is spot on. Without question, peace should be the objective. There you go, Governor DeSantis. Peace should be the objective. Stop the killings of hundreds of thousands of people and the colossal bloodshed and creating of millions of refugees and spending hundreds of billions of dollars. The U.S. should not provide assistance that could require the deployment of American troops or enable Ukraine to engage in offensive operations beyond its borders. F-16s and long-range missiles should therefore be off the table. These moves would risk explicitly drawing the United States into the conflict and drawing us closer to a hot war between the world's two largest nuclear powers. That risk is unacceptable. Again, every single answer there, 100% accurate, and drawing attention to very serious concerns. DeSantis goes on, a policy of regime change in Russia, no doubt popular among the DC foreign policy interventionists, would greatly increase the stakes of the conflict, making the use of nuclear weapons more likely. Such a policy would neither stop the death and destruction of the war, nor produce a pro-American Madisonian constitutionalist in the Kremlin. History indicates that Putin's successor in this hypothetical would likely be even more ruthless. Yeah, maybe. The cost to achieve such a dubious outcome could become astronomical. Yeah, again, I'm not entirely sure he's correct about who Putin's successor would be, but apart from that, exactly right. The Biden administration's policies have driven Russia into a de facto alliance with China. They sure have. Because China has not and will not abide by the embargo, Russia has increased its foreign revenues while China benefits from cheaper fuel. Coupled with his intentional depletion of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, nice jab there, and support for the left's Green New Deal, Biden has further empowered Russia's energy-dominated economy and Putin's war machine at Americans' expense. Our citizens are also entitled to know how the billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars are being utilized in Ukraine. We cannot prioritize intervention in an escalating foreign war over the defense of our own homeland, especially as tens of thousands of Americans are dying every year from narcotics smuggled across our open border, and our weapons arsenals, critical for our own security, are rapidly being depleted. You couldn't get any better than this answer. I mean, absolutely 100% spot on. Someone that understands the dangers that we're in. He doesn't say things that I might like to say about who's really started this war, because he doesn't need to. So politically smart answer, reminds people about all the important issues we're neglecting because of all the time and money we're spending in Ukraine and all the rest. Absolutely impeccable answer from Governor DeSantis. Next up, we have Mike Pence. Here we go. Is opposing Russia and Ukraine a vital American strategic national strategic interest? I don't know how to do a Pence voice. I don't know how to do a DeSantis voice either, so I'm just going to have to bear with me. When the United States supports Ukraine in their fight against Putin, when we follow the Reagan doctrine and we support those who fight our enemies on their shores, so we will not have to fight them ourselves, there is no room for Putin apologists in the Republican Party. This is not America's war. But if Putin is not stopped and the sovereign nation of Ukraine is not restored quickly, he will continue to move toward our NATO allies, and America would then be called upon to send our own. All of these things are untrue. First off, there's no evidence whatsoever that Putin has any intention of going anywhere beyond what he needs to stop Ukraine from killing Russians in Ukraine and Russia. That was what the war was all about, was preventing a genocide of Russians in Ukraine. And of course, there's no room for Putin apologists in the Republican Party. And of course, anyone who disagrees with me is a Putin apologist. So yeah, he's waging war on every reasonable person in the Republican Party. Vladimir Putin has revealed his true nature, a dictator consumed by conquest and willing to spend thousands of lives for his commitment to reestablish the greater Russian Empire. Again, just complete gibberish, nonsense, totally false. Anyone who thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine's border is not owning up to the reality of who Putin is. So totally false. We need to be clear-eyed about the Russian threat that Georgia, the Crimea, and Ukraine are merely at the top of Putin's list. Matter of fact, the U.S. is currently actively fomenting a color revolution in Georgia as we speak. Russia is reacting to our aggression first in Ukraine and now in Georgia. And by supporting Ukraine, we have told China we will support Taiwan should they follow Russia in an attempt to invade. Yeah, guess what, folks? China's reunifying, whether we like it or not. And if we think we're having a bad time in Ukraine, imagine the time we're going to have trying to stop China, which is right next to Taiwan, from just, taking over Taiwan. China could probably take over Taiwan in a weekend if they were determined to. And that sucks, but that's the reality. What specifically is our objective in Ukraine, and how will we know when we've achieved it? Victory for Ukraine, where Ukraine's sovereignty and peace are restored as quickly as possible. So what is our objective in Ukraine? Victory for Ukraine. What does victory mean? It's victory for Ukraine. Unfortunately, the Biden administration slow-walked aid to Ukraine. We didn't give it fast enough. Every response has been too slow, from providing intelligence to Ukraine to hammering Russia with sanctions to providing military equipment and fighter jets to Ukraine. This is just delusional at this point. First off, the sanctions completely backfired. Russia weathered the sanctions easily, drove them into China's arms. They've got now, as DeSantis pointed out, a de facto alliance with China, and providing military equipment and fighter jets to Ukraine, which they can't use because it takes months of training to be able to use them. So what is he talking about? Having our troops man that equipment? Having our Air Force engage in Russia? He's talking about going to nuclear war with Russia. That's what he's talking about. Ukraine's victory should be an unmistakable, undeniable defeat for Russia and its allies. Well, that's not going to happen. What is the limit of funding and materiel you would be willing to send to the government of Ukraine? This will be hilarious. As a fiscal conservative, I do not believe in sending blank checks and want oversight of government spending at home and abroad. But withholding or reducing support will have consequences. If Putin is not stopped now and he moves into NATO-controlled territory, the cost will be far greater. And that's always the neocons' argument for endless war is we have to fight them there before we have to fight them here. We have to spend all this money now before we have to spend even more money later. So he's just posturing as a fiscal conservative when he's really a complete neocon, and he wants to expand the war even farther. Should the United States support regime change in Russia? That is a better question for the thousands of Russian citizens jailed for protesting the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As many as 200,000 Russian troops have been killed or wounded in Putin's invasion of Ukraine. That question should be asked to those families grieving for their loss if they'd support a regime change. They'll say, no, you're making all that shit up. Russia's casualties are about 15,000. Given that Russia's actually, no, I think it's 15,000 killed, so it's more than that, but it's not 200,000. Given that Russia's economy and currency are stronger than before the war, do you believe that the U.S. sanctions have been effective? Given that Russia's economy and currency are stronger than before the war. Pence says, the Trump-Pence administration established devastating sanctions program that was the toughest U.S. administration on Russia since the Cold War. Again, that's ridiculous because Biden only added more sanctions. Sanctions against Russia could have been even more painful consequences, could have had even more painful consequences if the Biden administration moved quicker with the new sanctions and Western Europe had heeded U.S. warnings to look elsewhere for energy sources before we blew up their pipeline. So this is just lunacy. Russia's economy and currency are not stronger than before the war. The Russian economy is in free fall. Totally untrue. The Russian ruble is still afloat because of the extremely costly measures Russia has taken to keep their currency to pre-war levels in the face of sanctions. Russia is currently being propped up by China, and if China withdraws their support, Putin could run out of money by as soon as 2024. A, China has no signs of withdrawing their support, and B, there's also no evidence that Russia's economy is in this kind of shape. This war is costing Russia their economy, their military prowess, their position on the world stage, and it's costing lives. It's doing none of those things. In fact, now Russia has spent the entire war refining their systems and ironing out all of the flaws that it had. Now all of their soldiers are veterans. Now all of the military has far more readiness than it had, vastly more readiness than it had in 2014. Our military, by contrast, is now vastly weaker than it was a year ago. Do you believe the United States should faces the risk of nuclear war with Russia? And he doesn't quite answer. He says, Putin is still the small and bullying leader of Russia. His talk of nuclear war is a bullying tactic that he used at the start of the invasion. Yes, the nuclear doctrine. But Putin should know that the United States will not be bullied. This administration has not led with strength on the world stage, but America is still a nation that believes that peace comes through strength. The U.S.'s policy has been nuclear preemption, which is not Russia's policy. Russia's policy has been, we will not use nuclear weapons unless either in response to nuclear weapons or an imminent threat on Russia's, like on the existence of Russia. Whereas the United States' nuclear doctrine is, we'll use nuclear weapons whenever we damn well please with anybody. So there you go. So Mike Pence clearly articulating the neocon position, and quite possibly he's going to be the neocon pick for president. Because if you look down here, we'll come back to these other responses in a moment, but this is probably the key takeaway, guys. People that did not respond: Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, Asa Hutchinson, John Bolton, Chris Sununu, who probably are all neocons themselves. I mean, certainly Pompeo, certainly Bolton, certainly Haley. I don't know about Hutchinson, but his record as governor was atrocious. Chris Sununu, same thing. But what the neocons want is to have one pick for president and for a bunch of America First candidates dividing up those ballots on those early primary states so that the neocon can pick up those national delegates. Is it a strategy that will work? Probably not. I don't think it will. I think the Trumpsters are going to stay with Trump. I think other than Governor Ron DeSantis running, the rest of these guys are not going to get a whole lot of traction, no matter what. And who knows? I doubt that DeSantis will run because I think he knows it would split the Trump vote, but we'll see. Anyway, Vivek Ramaswamy gave answers so long that Tucker had to break him into. I guess blue checks get to have additional space for writing tweets, but Vivek's take up 3 of them, and the first one is all of this. So that's a lot to read through. We'll come back to old Vivek Ramaswamy, in a moment, but let's read some of these other ones. Kristi Noem. I might be able to do a Kristi Noem voice. I am familiar with her. Is opposing Russia and Ukraine a vital American national strategic interest? The primary external threat to the United States and communist China. There's a word missing from that sentence, but that's what she wrote. Our opposition to Russia has heightened this threat for a number of reasons. 1, it's pushing Russia into an alliance with China, meaning Russia may soon draw from China's large weapon arsenal. I'm just doing a voice in a higher pitch. That's not fair. I'll just read it as normal. 2, we're weakening our own military by sending weapons to a corrupt country. And 3, we're taking our eyes off the ball and allowing China to put favors in their bank. This should be Europe's fight, not ours. We should not waste taxpayer dollars at the risk of nuclear war. Well, that's a nice answer. She does touch on the threat of nuclear war. Smacking China. Although I would say, China is an economic threat. There's no indication they're a military threat. Not really. They haven't threatened anybody. Well, except Taiwan, but they consider Taiwan to be part of China. And she's right. It is pushing Russia into an alliance with China. And she's right about us weakening our own military, sending weapons to Ukraine. So very good. What specifically is our objective in Ukraine, and how will we know when we've achieved it? She says, the American people didn't get us into this war. Joe Biden did. Yes, Joe Biden and the neocons in general, some of whom were in Trump's White House as well, by the way. Biden has this fantasy that he can do the same kind of thing to Russia that Ronald Reagan did to the Soviet Union, that somehow through American military might, we're going to bring Putin to his knees. This fantasy is wasting a lot of American money and killing too many people. Wow. That's substantial. If we had a president who pursued peace through strength, Putin never would have dared to invade Ukraine. And again, this is all when she and others have said this, it's highly dubious. Putin invaded Ukraine for exactly the reason that we were pursuing peace through strength by funding NATO in Ukraine. That was the whole thing. The only way to avoid these kind of conflicts is to project strength. That's why voters must remove Biden and the Democrats from office. What is the limit of funding and materiel you would be willing to send to the government of Ukraine? Noam says, we've already overextended ourselves in our largesse to Ukraine, and the Ukrainian government is not made up of angels. They have a long history of corruption scandals, and recent news indicates that this issue is ongoing. This is true. The federal government is closing in on $200 billion in aid to Ukraine. We haven't spent that much to protect our border in the last 5 years combined. We must question whether we should prop up a corrupt regime to our own financial detriment. Solid points. Should the United States support regime change in Russia? No, not at this time, as it could lead to an even more destabilized Europe and cause escalation up the nuclear ladder. Great answer. Given that Russia's economy and currency are stronger than before the war, do you believe that sanctions have been effective? The United States has come to rely far too heavily on financial sanctions as a weapon of deterrence. Now, nations that hate America are consciously moving away from the US dollar as the world's currency. She didn't. Oh, wait, she goes on. Sanctions against China, Iran, and Russia have bolstered the Russian ruble and enabled China to establish trade in Chinese money rather than US dollars. One of the worst side effects of these sanctions has been the skyrocketing cost of oil and natural gas in America and around the world. Russia is selling less of its oil and gas. That's actually not true, but they are doing so at a much higher price. Actually, I think Russia did impose a brief cutting back on how much they're exporting. It's counterfactual to say that Russia's economy is stronger in the wake of the war. No, it's not. The more appropriate phrase here is more resilient. Well, we'll take that too. Russia has ridden out the sanctions remarkably well, but its economy remains weak and it'll get sucked into the global recession that it helped cause. Well, if Russia's economy was so weak, how'd they weather the sanctions? You know, I mean, isn't that the issue right there? You know, people say all the time, oh, Russia's economy is like the economy of Italy. It's an economy of like the size of Texas, et cetera, et cetera. Could Texas have withstood those sanctions? I doubt it. Do you believe the United States faces the risk of nuclear war with Russia? Christy Nome says, the Biden regime is taking us quickly up the escalatory ladder with a series of provocative actions and statements we cannot break down from any legitimate threat that Putin makes against the United States. We are closer now to the use of tactical nuclear weapons than we have ever been. That would be what Putin would use first. This is not about dropping the big one on New York or Los Angeles. Putin would slaughter thousands of souls in a contained fighting environment. Okay, this is a bunch of idiot gibberish. Wrong. You're so wrong, Christy. No, there is no such thing as a limited nuclear exchange. There's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. If Russia uses tactical nukes, we're using full-size nukes. Russia deploys the dead hand, and all these American cities are destroyed. That's the reality. There is no limitation of nuclear exchange. None at all. So that's complete nonsense from Christy, and that is a bit disconcerting, although her replies elsewhere were pretty good. Greg Abbott, let's hear what he has to say. We got a much shorter answer here. This is from Greg Abbott. President Biden's blank check foreign policy in Ukraine has drawn nothing but ridicule and disdain from our adversaries and has diverted money from essential needs in the United States. Throwing money at Ukraine with no accountability or objective is clearly failing. Worse is that President Biden's approach to Ukraine has been at the expense of underfunding or ignoring priorities at home. Before he sends any more money or assets to Ukraine's border, he must enforce our immigration laws and secure our southern border. As governor of Texas, I am focused on responding to this Biden-made border crisis and delivering real results for Texans this legislative session. I mean, these things are all true, but this is also a much more incomplete answer than the others gave. Lot of wiggle room here for but Putin's a threat, so we have to discard this. I don't trust Governor Greg Abbott at all. Tim Scott, who's also been shown in other aspects to be a rhino, but let's see what he says here. You have Americans who are frustrated because of the lack of leadership on domestic issues that only exacerbates the situation we see today in Ukraine. Here again, as with Abbott, these are distraction plays. I mean, it's a fair, solid argument to point out, yes, all the stuff we're doing in Ukraine is at the expense of Americans. That's the America first argument, and that's all well and good, but it's also ignoring a lot of other issues. Here's where we need the president to lead. What is our nation's vital interest in Ukraine? If I recall, Senator Scott, that's the question that Tucker posed to you. It should start with degrading the Russian military is in our vital national interest. So he does want war with Russia. In addition to that, we are not going to simply degrade the Russian military. We are gonna have accountability for every single dollar spent. There is no such thing as a blank check. We are going to make sure that there's accountability. The last point I'd make on the Ukraine front is that China has chosen a side. They are partnering with Putin, which means it's enmity with us. China is a risk that continues to rise, an adversarial position that they have taken against the American people. We should hear what they're telling us, believe them, and act accordingly. So basically a neocon position that Tim Scott's taking. Yeah, Russia is a big threat. China is a big threat. We're going to have to destroy Russia somehow. So there you go. And he's trying to wiggle out of it with this America first argument at the top, but that's clearly where Tim Scott is going. So typical double speak from a candidate who always tries to work both sides. All right, now we have big fat tub of shit Chris Christie. Let's see what he says. Sorry if I got a little personal with Chris Christie. It's with me, Chris Christie is personal, and that's a story for another night. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a national security issue that threatens our alliances and our standing in the world. Our objective is to assist Ukraine sufficiently to enable them to defeat Russian forces and restore their sovereignty. This effort is not about regime change in Russia. It's about respecting the sovereignty of free nations. Complete bullshit. Also, this is a proxy war being waged by Russia's ally, China, against the United States. Complete total inversion of reality. This is a proxy war being waged by the United States against Russia, and Ukraine is our proxy. Due to their assistance to Russia and China's recent action in the Middle East, it would be naive to call this anything but Chinese aggression. Again, just completely retarded and dangerous. Seeing how well it's going fighting Russia, he thinks let's also take on China. Our allies and our enemies are watching us. It is on us to assist our democratic allies in defending themselves against authoritarian aggression. Of course, Ukraine is not a democracy. It's a government that we installed in 2014 that was completely corrupt and has now actually outlawed all political parties, dissenting media, and everything else, and is now press ganging teenagers off the streets to conscript them into their military. If we do not, this aggression will spread, and the void we leave will be filled by authoritarian regimes like China, Iran, and North Korea, and an empowered Russia if they triumph over Ukraine. So there's Chris Christie, bloodthirsty maniac, complete idiot. It's coming from Chris Elkstrom, the response of a rabid rhino. Yes, he is. And the following candidates did not respond: Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, Asa Hutchinson, Ambassador John Bolton, and Governor Chris Sununu. Why didn't they respond? All right, I don't know if I want to read through this entire Vivek Ramaswamy comment because that's going to make this video a lot longer because it's very long what he wrote. I'll tell you what, I'm just going to scan and maybe if there's anything interesting that's different from anything else that we've seen here, I'll try to make a note of that. And of course, you can always just pause the video on your own time and just read through this. This is Vivek Ramaswamy's answer, part 1 of 3. And again, you see a lot of these things seem very similar to what the others have said, or some of the others have said. The main thing should be the main thing, he says. Focus on China. China wants the Ukraine war to last as long as possible to deplete Western military capacity before invading Taiwan. This is dubious. In fact, China is supposed to be visiting the Kremlin this week to talk about arranging a peace deal. We've spent 20 years droning people in caves in the Middle East and Central Asia and have little to show for it. Good point. We should be taking out the people who have caused the death of more than 100,000 Americans every year, the Mexican drug cartels. I like that. What is our objective in Ukraine? Our objective in Ukraine should be to respect any prior legal treaty, the commitments the U.S. has made, so as to preserve our credibility when it comes to commitments in the future, which is, I believe, we have already fulfilled and indeed gone beyond. I make a clear distinction between commitments to which Congress was made aware and approved and whatever secret deals the Biden administration may have cooked up. I don't know if that's a reference to the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline or not, but somewhat interesting. Let's read this again. To respect any prior legal treaty commitments the U.S. has made. Well, the Minsk Accords were not made by the U.S. Those were between Europe, who admitted they were all a sham, and Ukraine. Commitments to which Congress was made aware and approved. Yeah, I don't quite follow what he's saying here. The Budapest Memorandum signed by Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. and the UK. Okay, here's what he's talking about. Was supposed to assure Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, a massive stockpile, and just received security protections, but not an alliance or pledge to go to war. Just a commitment to respect the sovereignty of existing borders. Ukraine completely broke that deal. They were, and so did the U.S. They put NATO into Ukraine. That was the right decision to make in 1994 is a point of reasonable debate, but it is our long-term self-interest to stick by our word, and we have, but now it's time to move on. Okay, so he goes on, and a key objective already achieved by revealing Russia to be a paper tiger. Okay, so that's complete bullshit. Our second objective is to deter Putin from aggression against other European nations, including NATO powers. Well, that's misleading too, because Putin didn't commit aggression against any European nation. NATO committed aggression against Russia by threatening to exterminate Russians in Ukraine. They're studying that Biden lobbied against the EU adopting its Russian oil ban while simultaneously sending $113 billion in aid to Ukraine to fight against Russia. Biden lobbied against the EU adopting its Russian oil ban. I'm not even sure that's accurate. A third objection is nudging, shaking if necessary, so threatening the Europeans to take care of themselves. I believe in America First 2.0, and we should at least get the Europeans to Europe First 1.0. Yeah, so we're gonna bully and browbeat Europe into not being bullied and browbeaten. Okay, yeah, sure. That's how that goes. Okay, so this guy's like the Gary Yang of the Republican, or not Gary Yang. Who's the guy that ran for president, the Democrat? Andrew Yang. That's it, Andrew Yang. So okay. Well, there you go, folks. Those were the Republican candidates on Ukraine. So overall, absolutely spot on answers from Governor Ron DeSantis. Decent answers from Donald Trump, Kristi Noem, and who was the other one? That was about it, I suppose. And then god awful, reprehensible answers, full of falsehoods from Mike Pence, Chris Christie, and Tim Scott, and some kind of evasive answers from Greg Abbott. So there you go on arguably one of the most important issues in the presidential race, and the major candidates have just put themselves on the record. So hope this analysis was helpful. There you go. We'll put this on our Rumble channel. We're not live on Rumble right now, but thanks guys for tuning in. And as always, thanks for all you do for liberty. And I hope, by the way, today that means calling your representative in the House and the Senate in Michigan, because there's going to be more bills moving through this week, certainly in the Senate, possibly the House. What we're hearing is right to work repeal today in the Senate, along with prevailing wage mandate, and some sort of gun bills tomorrow, probably universal gun registration, possibly red flag, possibly lock up your safety. So we'll see. So keep those phones ringing, keep those emails coming. All right, thanks guys. Talk to you next time.